Thanks very much, Ceann Comhairle, for the opportunity to discuss this budget. The budget, I suppose everybody would agree, contains many positive measures that are very badly needed to address the cost of living. However, I would have to say that despite all of the measures, and most of them are once-off, and we know the reasons that they're once-off, that the world is in a perilous state economically, I think most would agree. And I suppose we're uniquely exposed, because we continually talk about being such an open trading economy. We're open to the European Union. We're a member of the European Union. Germany's in recession. The British government seem determined to throw themselves off the nearest cliff. We're very much open to the calamity that they vest upon themselves. So while there are lots of one-off measures, everybody seems to accept that these one-off measures can't be continued indefinitely. But on the other hand, what I don't see in this budget is any strategy towards addressing the rising cost of living and the root causes of it. Because, the main causes of the cost of the inflation in Ireland, as everywhere in Europe, is energy. But, we had a huge problem with imported energy in Ireland at the foundation of this state almost 100 years ago. And one of the first things that the then Free State government did was try to address that, try to become self-sufficient in energy, because at the end of the day, we have absolutely no control over the cost of imported energy. We have some control over the cost of potentially generating electricity. That's why, for example, Germany is in such huge trouble. They put all their eggs into the basket of Russian gas. France maintained its nuclear reactors, so they're able to power themselves. We spent 20% of the GDP of this state for the first years of this state, and there were huge competing demands for that money. We spent 20% of that to achieve energy self-sufficiency, and we achieved it. Now, the only thing that I saw towards your government, Minister, the government of which you're a Minister of State, continually talks about offshore wind will solve all of our problems. Yet, almost 12 months ago, Equinor, or Statoil, the biggest player in the market, left the market because they had absolutely no confidence in their ability to do business in Ireland. Much more recently, last Thursday, Shell announced that they were leaving the market. Now, there'll be some in this House who'll say it's great to get Shell out of it. It's great to get these foreign companies out. But the reality is that we wouldn't have built Ardnacrusha Crusher without Siemens. We didn't have the technological capability to do it, primarily, and we don't have the technological capability to harness all this wind energy off the west coast of Ireland. So the only reaction to this conundrum, this long-term problem, other than, of course, throw money at it in the short term, money that everybody accepts we mightn't have next year or the year after, is to formally fund the setting up of MARA to the tune of 4.3 million euros. So in the context of an overall budget where the biggest problem to be surpassed is cost of living caused by the rising cost of energy, the GDP of this state is now at about projected to be at 460 billion by the end of this year, and to grow thereafter. So 20% of that is give or take 60 billion euros. And the government, to address the single biggest problem, to put a strategy in place to address that, is going to spend 4.3 million. It does beggar belief in terms of a lack of strategy to deal with the underlying problem. Not a will to deal with the day-to-day causes, to bail out businesses, bail out households. I agree that needs to be done. But we also need to address the underlying problem. And I see absolutely no sign of that from your government. The other major cause of inflation last year in Ireland, other than rising energy costs, was rising housing costs. And to add to the cost of building a house for any young family, or indeed old family, or whatever age you are, you'll pay the same amount, regardless of where you are in the country, you pay an additional 10% levy for your concrete. That is to pay for the MICA redress scheme, which again, no problem with the MICA redress scheme. But at the time it was being passed through, I argued that we do the opposition the courtesy of going through their amendments, but that we look at recouping some of the costs of that from the quarry owners that caused this problem. And of course, one of the biggest companies in Ireland, CRH, owns many of those quarries now. Owned less of them at the time, but they obviously thought they were a good buy, that the government would do sweet damn all to recoup any money. And sure enough, the government are recouping the money, or some of it, from everybody who wants to build a house. So everybody who wants to build a house, who can't really afford to build a house because the cost has gone up dramatically, and they weren't allowed to build a house during COVID, now they'll pay. There's lots of rising costs. The price of wood went up dramatically. The price of steel went up dramatically. The price of concrete produced in Ireland is now going to rise 10% for each and every one of those people because of your budget. I just don't see how that adds up into a strategy to reduce the cost of living in circumstances where the major drivers of inflation are energy, which I've dealt with, and housing costs, which I've just mentioned. So you make it more expensive to build houses in order to get more housing stock on the market to reduce inflation. Maybe you'll respond to that. I'd rather expect not, but I'd look for, if you could, I would appreciate it, Minister. And I do appreciate your sitting in. It's not your department, but it is your government. There are two other things I want to mention briefly. This so-called universal payment towards the cost of childcare. I mean, it's not universal. It's everybody who comes through the National Childcare Scheme, which is, I accept, a lot, but not everybody. There's no sort of tax credit system as exists in the UK towards the cost of childcare. So it's not going to be universal. And it was being flagged as universal by the minister, the line minister, Minister O'Gorman. And the last thing is a particularly nasty little thing which was put into the resolutions, and everybody should read them very carefully, because there was a Supreme Court case taken about the disabled drivers and the disabled passenger scheme. And it was so circumscribed that it was too circumscribed to comply with the legislation. So that you actually had to be missing a limb in order to qualify for it. It wasn't enough to have a condition that meant that you couldn't drive. You had to be missing a limb. So the Supreme Court found this invalid. And instead of broadening the scheme to help these people, to give them some degree of independence, and their parents and those who drive them, to be able to help them, give them some degree of independence, instead of broadening the scheme as any decent human being might envisage would happen, the government used the cloak of budget night and a budget resolution down in the convention centre to narrow the scheme on the express promise that we look at this and we broaden it.
The time is up.
Still hasn't happened. 2 years later, it needs to happen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Count Gurley, for your attitude.